Let's just be clear before we move on to Romans 8, what we are saying then about the future life beyond the grave. I have taken funerals, I have attended funerals of people I have loved and lost, and the question everyone wants to ask at funerals is, where are they now? Where is she now? Where is he now? That's a very natural question. That is the question that love wants to ask, and I honor that.
So we talk a lot about going to heaven after we die, but this idea of heaven and earth overlapping, we don't talk a lot about that.
Which is kind of crazy because the union of heaven and earth is what the story of the Bible is all about.
What you experience after death as a believer when you are with the Lord is just as real as what you will experience after we have the new heaven and earth, a globalized Eden, because that's where God's presence will be as well. One is not more real than the other.
But when it comes to intermediate state, Paul talks about being with the Messiah, which is far better. Philippians 1. Call it paradise if you like, as Jesus says to the dying brigand in Luke 23. Or the temporary dwelling, the monai polai, which Jesus talks about in John 14. You can even call it heaven if you want, though the Bible doesn't do that. But the problem is this: the church's mission is shaped by its eschatology, whether it knows that or not.
Welcome to another episode of Ring Them Bells. We believe in the power of the good news and that Jesus has defeated evil and is king of our world. We exist to help you rediscover the supernatural focus of your Bible. We believe that the supernatural focus has been suppressed, and we're here to help bring that back into the light. We do that through incredible content creation. We have mashups and interviews with some of the best scholars featuring N.T. Wright, Tim Mackey of the Bible Project, and Dr. Michael Heiser. All of this content creation supports our nonprofit ministry here at Ring Them Bells, where we provide pop-up feeding centers for the homeless and also specialize in hurricane relief. If you haven't yet, please take a second. It only takes a moment for you, but means so much for this ministry. Subscribe and turn on the alerts, as this is the best way to connect with our channel.
Let me give you the majority view here, and it's also the majority held by, I think it's fair to say, most evangelicals when it comes to the Old Testament. They will say things like, well, for the Israelite and for the Old Testament, when someone dies, their spirit goes to Sheol. Sheol is the biblical Hebrew term. It's fairly frequent. That can be translated the grave or the underworld. Okay, so there's the grave, the thing you put the body in, and then deeper within the earth is this holding tank. Okay, it's the underworld. It's Sheol. It's the place where the dead go. These are metaphors for the afterlife. See, the afterlife doesn't have latitude, longitude, spatiality, and so it's very natural to think that when we die, we put people in the ground, and obviously that's where their body stays, so their soul must go down there somewhere too. And so that, gave genesis to this idea of the afterlife being the underworld. And lest we think that's odd, we still talk about that now. But we typically say, in the bad place, you're going to go down there as opposed to up there. Okay, but the dominant view is that Sheol is the answer, and everybody went to Sheol, whether they were good or bad, righteous or wicked, in the Old Testament. I'm not there. Okay, that's not actually my view. I'm with the minority here, because I think there are places in Psalms and outside of the Psalms as well, where the Old Testament person who was righteous at least had the hope that when I die, the Lord will not leave me in Sheol. I will go to the realm of the dead, but the righteous, the hope was that the Lord would remove them. So you get a few verses in Psalms that talk about being in the presence of the Lord, walking with the Lord, all this. Well, the Lord's not living in Sheol, okay? It's somewhere else. It's where God is, and he's up there, not down there. He's not in the realm of the dead, he's up there. And then you have other verses about being buried, going to be with the God of their fathers. And archaeologically speaking, Israelites and other people would bury their dead with objects they used in this life. Okay, that tells you they believed that there was a conscious existence beyond this life that was, it wasn't like they were giving them fire-resistant suits, buried with them, okay? That they would give them things that they enjoyed, food, pets, toys, because the assumption was they're going to use these things in the afterlife. So archaeologically, you don't even need the Bible for this, but archaeologically, that's evidence of a positive afterlife. So I am in the minority. I don't think that the Old Testament presents a consistently neutral or pessimistic view of this. Mesopotamia was really pessimistic. Egypt was like, yeah, I can't wait to die. Of course, with the Egyptians, it started out with that was only Pharaoh. And then later on in Egyptian history, the positive afterlife was democratized to other people. But they tend to be positive. Mesopotamians are like, this is just awful. But I think Israel is a little bit different. But I'm in the minority there. Now, when you get to the New Testament, Paul says things like, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. Now, New Testament scholars like to say, he's getting that from Greek philosophy and Plato this and that. Well, okay, I'm sure Paul read that stuff, but I'm also sure that you have passages in the Old Testament that convey the same idea. So I'm not buying the notion that Paul got his afterlife thinking from completely non-biblical sources.
So in the Bible, the ideas of heaven and earth are ways of talking about God's space and our space.
So I understand our space really well. We live here. There's trees, rivers, mountains. But my understanding of God's space gets a little fuzzy.
And what we do get in the Bible are images trying to help us grasp God's space, which is basically inconceivable to us.
So these are two very different types of spaces.
Yes, they're different in their nature, but here's what's really interesting is that in the Bible, these are not always separate spaces. So think of heaven and earth as like different dimensions that can overlap in the same exact space.
So we talk a lot about going to heaven after we die, but this idea of heaven and earth overlapping, we don't talk a lot about that.
Which is kind of crazy because the union of heaven and earth is what the story of the Bible is all about. And so for a long time, when I was introduced to what the story of Christianity in the Bible is all about, it was a way of telling the story of the Bible that went like this. Everything was created to be perfect. Humans give in to sin and death, and make it all bad and terrible. And through Jesus, everything is going to be perfect again one day. You guys tracking with me? It's a very common way of retelling the story. The problem with that retelling of the story is the Bible. Because that's not how the story begins. It doesn't begin perfect. It begins with darkness and disorder and chaos. And out of that state of chaos, God doesn't make something that's perfect. He makes something that is 7 times over called, in Genesis 1, it's called good. And I'm pretty sure good doesn't mean perfect. Good means good, yeah? But perfect means complete. And so the way the biblical authors tell the story is God brought order and goodness out of chaos. But then when he puts the human in the garden, in proximity to his own life, what that is an opportunity for good to become complete. And that is an opportunity that is forfeited and never realized in the biblical story because they make the dumb choice, and they go where? They go out into the wilderness, and then it ends up in a flood again. Are you with me? So in other words, the resolution to the biblical story, Jesus comes onto the scene not to restore a perfection that was lost, but it's actually to reclaim a future and a destiny that has never been experienced by any human before. Are you tracking with me? And so, what I'm talking about is the overall, how we imagine the story that we're living in. So I think within Jesus' imagination, when he encounters suffering and pain, it's not, well, we live in a world that fell from perfection and God's trapped us here where we're all suffering. And man, if he was just nicer to us, he would let us at least, give us some air and give us some, right? I mean, this story tends toward a portrait of God, that he kicked us out of the good place and he's keeping us down here and we're suffering. And if he was nicer to us, he might give us some relief. And that's not how the biblical story works.
The union of heaven and earth is what the story of the Bible is all about. How they were once fully united and then driven apart, and about how God is bringing them back together once again.
So let's go back to the beginning.
In Genesis 1, God creates a beautiful, ordered reality out of darkness and disorder so that life can flourish. He appoints humans as his representatives to rule over all of it, and 7 times God calls it good.
Yeah, I experience that kind of goodness often in the world, in things like beauty and truth, love and generosity.
But in Genesis 3, we meet a creature who's in a state of rebellion against his creator. We're not told yet why or how he rebels, but he's on a mission to ruin God's good world for other creatures.
This thing is trouble.
Yeah, this creature is the Bible's first portrait of evil. It distorts what God has purposed for good, ruining and dragging creation back into darkness and disorder.
So the humans join the spiritual rebel, which leads them back into chaos and death.
And from this point on, the human rebellion is interwoven with a spiritual rebellion. And the biblical story shows how this happens over and over again. Yeah, this is what the Bible's description of the Garden of Eden is all about. It's a place where God and humanity dwelt together perfectly, no separation, and humans then partner with God in building a flourishing, beautiful world and so on.
But as humans, we wanted to do things a different way. We wanted God out, and we wanted to create a world apart from him.
Yeah, so we have these 2 spaces now. And the Bible actually uses lots of different kinds of words and phrases to refer to these 2 spaces to make a clear distinction.
So you've said that these spaces can overlap, though. So explain how that works.
Yeah, this is where we have to start talking about temples. Because in the biblical world, you experience God's presence by going to a temple. That's where heaven and earth overlap.
Now, there are 2 types of temples described in the Bible. One is a tabernacle, basically a tent that was built by Moses. And the other was this massive building made by Solomon.
And these temples were decorated with fruit trees and flowers and images of angels and all kinds of gold and jewels and so on. And these are designed to make you feel like you're going back to the garden. And at the center of the temple was a place called the Holy of Holies, which was like the hot spot of God's presence.
Now we can go and be with God again.
But not so fast, because the temple also creates a problem. So God's space is full of his presence and goodness and justice and beauty, but human space is full of sin and injustice and the ugliness that results.
So how do these spaces overlap if they're so different and they're in conflict with each other?
This was resolved through animal sacrifice.
Yeah, that's kind of weird. What do animal sacrifices have to do with this?
Yeah, the idea is this. Animal sacrifices, somehow they absorb the sin when the animal dies in your place. And it creates a clean space, so to speak, where you are now free to enter into the temple and be in God's presence.
Okay, so if I'm an Israelite and I live in Jerusalem, I might be able to be in God's presence. But you said the story of the Bible is all of heaven and earth reuniting.
So there's this in-between time that Paul talks about being with Jesus. Jesus here talks about being with him where he is at, and that there's a place for them in God's heavenly temple.
Correct.
So there's something happening here, and it's very foggy. We don't have a clear perspective of what it is.
Yeah, Jesus called it paradise to the guy crucified next to him. Today you'll be with me in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
That's what he says, which was a cosmic temple.
Is this a disembodied state?
Well, I think it has to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So there is some sort of interim disembodied state that Jesus and Paul both talk about.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. But it's not a permanent state, and it's not the end of the story. because it doesn't solve the problem. The problem is about the relationship between heaven and earth. That's the biblical drama. But that's not what Jesus is talking about in John 14. He's talking to his friends who are traumatized by the fact that he just said, I'm going to go get crucified.
During first century Judaism, what were the paradigms that they had of an after death, pre-resurrection state?
We talked about this in the Holy Spirit question and response about your soul or body or spirit.
Yeah.
So the conviction is, if my life belongs to God and his love, then death is not the end. And God's love is going to bring new life and bring a new creation. That's the biblical drama, the biblical storyline. What that leaves a question of is, okay, so what happens to me if I die this side of the new creation, and in that time period before, what do I cease to exist? And that's not how any of the biblical authors put it. How they put it is God will take me to himself, that he will sustain me by his love and creative power. And by nature, that has to be in a non-embodied state.
Because you don't have
my
a body.
body's in the, cremated or in the ground.
Decomposed.
Yeah. But yeah, none, there's just...
Unless you have some sort of different type of body.
Yeah.
But the idea is that you're going to be reunited with your body.
Yeah, the hope is what happened to Jesus, the empty tomb, is what will happen to his people in the resurrection and in the new creation. Yeah. And so Jesus, again, we have a whole session on this in the Heaven and Earth book, is like John, in the Revelation, John didn't have a little video camera that he looked into to wonder what the new creation would be like. They were eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus. They ate food with him. They touched him.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the same Jesus that they walked around with in Galilee, but he was at the same time a different Jesus, fundamentally.
Mm-hmm.
Like his body had really strange properties,
Yeah.
And at some moments they couldn't recognize him, like Mary or the two on the road to Emmaus.
Mm-hmm.
And so these are ways of talking about how whatever the new creation is, it's a renewal of this world.
Yeah.
But it will be so fundamentally transformed that it's also not this world.
Yeah.
This is also the same dynamic at work in the of this world or not of this world language in the Gospel of John.
Right, which I wanted to talk to you about.
Yeah.
So maybe we could jump there.
Yeah. So it's by nature a disembodied state after death, and you're with Jesus. He says it here. Paul says it. Jesus said it to the guy crucified next to him. But again, as we say in the video, that's not the focus of the biblical story.
If there's such this conviction that, you are a body and you don't really have an essence outside of your body, then how can there be a sense of a disembodied state?
Yeah. Well, we just don't have, in the Old Testament, you just die. And you're
Didn't
in the
they
grave.
summon a spirit? Didn't someone summon some sort of spirit?
Man, there's one occasion. Yeah. The Witch of Endor. Right at the end of 1 Samuel.
Yeah.
Such an amazing... I still remember reading that story for the first time and the little title summary.
Just
in
says
my
Witch
New
of
American
Endor.
Standard Bible, the Witch of Endor.
And you're like, am I reading Tolkien?
Yeah. She summons up the Ruach of Samuel.
The breath.
From the dead.
Yeah.
It's a bizarre story.
So that's some sort of disembodied state.
It's the only story like it in the entire Bible, where a person who's
dead,
their presence or life presence makes it an appearance to somebody in some kind of magic ceremony. Seriously, it's the only place in the entire Bible where that happens.
Yeah, it's a strange story.
It's a very strange story.
But obviously there's some sort of category then of
Yeah, there's a category for
post-death, disembodied essence of who you are.
Yeah, that's right. But it has nothing to do with the inherent immortality of the human soul. It has to do with God's commitment to not let his beloved people be destroyed by death, but that he preserves the life of his people beyond death and through death and then out into new creation. And just the biblical authors don't have much more to say about it except for these images of being with Jesus or being in the temple, even in God's heavenly temple.
We need your help. Ring Them Bells is a non-profit organization where every dollar donated goes right back into the mission of spreading the good news and helping those in need. The main ministry of Ring Them Bells is serving those in need in the name of our King Jesus. We create pop-up feeding centers all across the United States to help feed the homeless. We also specialize in hurricane relief. We go into the hardest hit areas. We bring free cooked food. We bring important supplies. We're going to bring prayer to these people, and most importantly, we bring hope to those in need. And you can help with this. Over the past year, we have fed over 2,000 meals, and next year, we want to double that. We can't do this without your support. Everything we create here and all of the food that we serve is free because it's paid for by generous viewers just like you. If you feel led to donate and join the mission with us here at Ring Them Bells, click the Give Butter link in the notes and comments of this video. For anyone who donates monthly, we want to say thank you. We're going to mail you out some swag. You're going to be joined into our exclusive Bells Angels Club, where you'll get swag and exclusive content that no one else gets. If you can't support us financially, please continue to like and share the content, as this helps us so much with spreading the good news about what Jesus has done for our world.
Right. So we have to keep going in the story where we come to Jesus in the New Testament. And in the Gospel of John, we hear this claim that God became human in Jesus and made his dwelling among us. Now, this word dwelling is really curious. It means he set up a tabernacle among us. And so what John is claiming right here is that Jesus is a temple. He is now the place where heaven and earth overlap.
What's interesting about Jesus is that he isn't staying in this safe, clean space. He's running around hanging out with sinners. He's healing people of their sicknesses and forgiving people of their sins.
He's basically creating little pockets of heaven where people can be in God's presence, but he's doing it out there in the middle of the world of sin and death.
And he keeps telling everyone that the kingdom of heaven is at hand.
And he even told his followers to pray regularly that God's kingdom come and that his will be done here on earth just as it is in heaven.
But a lot of people are threatened by Jesus and they kill him, which seems to spoil this whole plan to reunite heaven and earth.
But we have to go back to a scene earlier on in Jesus' story where John the Baptist saw Jesus and said, "Behold, this is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world."
So Jesus isn't just talked about as being a temple, he's also talked about as being the temple sacrifice.
Yeah, so the cross is now the place where Jesus absorbs sin to create a clean space that is not limited like animal sacrifices. Jesus' sacrifice has the power to keep spreading and reuniting more and more of heaven and earth.
And this is all really great, but it leaves one big question in my mind, which is, what happens when I die? Don't I just fly over to God's space to be with Jesus?
Yeah, so a few times in the New Testament, we learn that Christians will be with Jesus in heaven after they die, but that is not the focus of the Bible story. The focus is on how heaven and earth are being reunited through Jesus and will be completely brought together one day when he returns. So in the book of Revelation, we get this beautiful image of the Garden of Eden, now in the form of a city, coming to end the age of sin and death by redeeming all of human history in a renewed creation. And God's space and human space completely overlap once again.
Okay, so now we've seen that the story of the Bible is not concerned with life after death. The Bible is mainly concerned with telling the story of heaven and earth fully uniting. It's actually the life after death that the Bible mainly speaks of. The Bible's focus is on a renewed creation that will fully dwell with God and reign here on earth like he currently does in heaven. But still, the question remains, for what happens after we die? What happens to those who accept Christ and his rule? What happens to those who reject Christ and stand with evil? We know for sure the Bible has very little to say on the interim state in between now and the day of the Lord. But with what little evidence we do have, let's explore these fascinating questions with Dr. Michael Heiser and see what happens when we die, both to those who embrace Christ and to those who reject the hope we have in Jesus.
Luke 16, Jesus tells a parable about a rich man in hell who asks Abraham to send Lazarus to bring a drop of water. Is that meant to give an accurate display of afterlife, or was Jesus using an illustration? Yeah, there's a big debate in biblical scholarship whether Luke 16 is a parable or whether it's a story of real events, something like that. I don't really know which one it is, and I'll be honest with you, I don't think it really matters. Because let's just say it's a parable. Well, you've got plenty of other passages that aren't parables that describe the same, describe the negative afterlife. Let's just use that phrase. Hell, Hades, whatever. So you don't need Luke 16 for the idea. If it's not, then you get yet another description. It's cosmic geography. Again, heaven and hell, these terms that the biblical writers use, these are not places with latitude and longitude. So they are efforts on the part of the biblical writer to describe, a place of, everlasting wonderfulness, if that's a word, for the righteous, for those who are believers, and the exact opposite for those who are not. And since that place, let me just look at how we have to struggle to even talk about this. Just because that place that really isn't a literal place, again, it has no latitude and longitude. You couldn't journey there in the physical world, okay? But it's still, it's still a reality. And so for people who like us and like the biblical writers who are embodied, who only know of a physical reality, they don't know what a disembodied reality is like. They have to use the language of physical embodiment to even try to describe this. And the descriptions aren't uniform. I mean, they're consistent with each other, but they're not uniform. I mean, what I mean by that is, if you go through the New Testament, if you gathered all of these, Luke 16 is going to be kind of unique with the drop of water thing, and referring to it as Abraham's bosom. Okay, the good side of it, with the great gulf fixed between the good side and the bad side. So that's pretty unique in biblical material, but biblical material will use other descriptions to describe the same afterlife condition. And it's not just, the negative one, it's also the positive one. So you don't get uniform descriptions. I wouldn't expect uniform descriptions. You're going to get a variety of descriptions that basically, in a nutshell, tell you want to be in this part, but you don't want to be in the other one. So, we're just sort of the writers and us too are locked into how do we describe this. And a lot of the writers will use, phrases that are common to their own audience, obviously. Again, we're trying to interpret things in the original context. And so you'll see descriptions like in Second Temple Jewish literature that sound very much like what you see in the New Testament. There's kind of a common pool of vocabulary in the Second Temple period from which writers can draw to talk about this or to attempt again to get the messaging across. This is the place you want to be. This is the place where you don't want to be. One is the realm of the dead. One isn't. One is, where God is. The other one is, a place of torment and so on and so forth. So whether Jesus is using a parable here to illustrate this thing that is talked about quite frequently, both in terms of Second Temple literature and elsewhere in the New Testament, maybe that's all it is. Maybe it's not a parable. Maybe he's just talking more directly about this place. Does it really make any difference at the end of the day? Because the subject matter is going to be the same, whether it's a parable or whether it's not. The subject matter is the same, and there are plenty of other passages that aren't parables, that aren't even in that discussion, that describe the same situation.
What happens to a person who dies without Christ? What is your take on eternal punishment, annihilation, etc.? How does the resurrection of the unjust fit into this?
Well, I mean, if Adam and Eve, again, I do believe they had conditional immortality. In other words, if they wouldn't have sinned and they perpetually abide in the presence of God, essentially God's house, so to speak, Eden, they would have kept on living. Okay, so I would say it's conditional immortality. Everybody has, if we want to reverse the language, everybody's mortal. They're gonna die of something. So, if they're kicked out of the garden, and really the rest of humanity sort of follows this template that we aren't born into the presence of God, we are, have to be brought back into relationship with God. That's just another way of saying salvation is needed. So that is, kind of the one thing that to me just seems the most obvious. If we're going back to the Edenic scene and then thinking about it theologically, what happens to a person who dies without Christ? Well, they have a Christless eternity. They spend eternity outside the presence of God, the family of God. They, to use other scriptural language, they're lost. That sort of thing. That naturally takes us into where the questioner took us. What's your take on eternal conscious punishment or annihilation, so on and so forth. I think for me, both of those things are actually still on the table. And I've said before on the podcast that it really depends on how you read certain language, especially in the book of Revelation when it describes final judgment. So when I look at it, the thing that really puts annihilation on the table for me is the reference to the death of death, both in Revelation and also one place in 1 Corinthians. If death itself is truly destroyed, and that is what you actually read in the book of Revelation, then I don't know how death could be eternally ongoing. It's either destroyed or it's not. And so annihilation seems to make a lot of sense in respect to that verse. And of course, if you have annihilation, that's permanent. So the judgment is permanent. The separation is permanent. Does it have to be conscious? Is really the question for some people. And some will take like Revelation 14:11, the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever. Well, if they were destroyed, again, the results of that are permanent too. And the smoke could just be a reference to the fact that they had been destroyed. They had been consumed and annihilated in the flames. So the language of going up forever and ever just doesn't really help resolve the debate. That's part of why there is a debate. So I think for me, both of those things are on the table. If push came to shove, I think annihilation makes the best sense, but it's certainly not the only view that you could come out of that passage, and at least one other with. Again, it's hard for me to see how death itself could be destroyed and yet be ongoing in an eternal way. That those two things just don't seem to go together. But again, I'm not willing to to sort of push the more traditional view to the side. But I think annihilation really needs serious consideration. And like I said, for me, they're both on the table.
Where does the believer who has died reside until the return of Christ?
Well, the short answer is he resides in the afterlife. In other words, and the afterlife is the spiritual realm. Now, again, that realm doesn't have literal latitude and longitude. All afterlife terms, whether they're in the Bible or the ones we use, they sound geographical. We talk about people passing over, going to the other side. Well, again, we use these physical terms, these physical descriptors, these geographical descriptors, because the way we talk requires a sense of place. It requires physical location because we're embodied. We that's all we can relate to, place and location. But all the terms are metaphors from passing from our realm, the realm of the embodied, the human realm, to the divine realm, the supernatural realm, the unseen realm, the spiritual realm, whatever you want to call it. And over in that realm, again, we still have more place location terms. We talk about heaven, we talk about hell. Heaven being the place that's associated in the spiritual realm with the presence of God, hell being the place that is certainly not the presence of God. So we even use geographical terminology to talk about the disembodied spiritual world. But we just have to do that because that's all we can really process and understand. The idea is that the afterlife includes both reward in the presence of God for believers, who've believed in what God asked them to believe, and it also includes separation from God's presence for those who have not believed what God says they need to believe. So that's how I would approach that question. Where does the believer who has died reside until the return of Christ? I think Paul's clear that to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. We go to the afterlife, we go to the spiritual realm, and we are with the Lord. 2 Corinthians 5, 6, 8, again, I might as well read it. We have here, so we are always of good courage, Paul says. We know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So there he contrasts being embodied in our natural realm as opposed to being in the realm where God is, the realm of the disembodied, the afterlife. And specifically, again, the subset of the afterlife, the place where God's presence is. But intermediate state, again, I think we call it intermediate. At least my experience in reading theology and teaching theology, we use this, again, as sort of a term that is a precursor to the new heaven and the new earth. And I would just say this. Before, what you experience after death as a believer when you are with the Lord is just as real as what you will experience after we have the new heaven and earth, a globalized Eden, because that's where God's presence will be as well. One is not more real than the other. Again, we sort of think of this pre-state as something, again, lesser than the ultimate kingdom. And that's natural for us to do because we can't really understand what life is like disembodied, whereas we can when we talk about the global Eden, the new heaven and the new earth. To me, they're six of one and a half a dozen of another because they're both as real. They are both where God is. Yes, there's a difference, again, because we are re-embodied in glorified bodies for that existence. And even if you look at the afterlife descriptions in the New Testament prior to, of course, the ultimate consummation of the kingdom in the new heaven and new earth, there's still embodiment language used. When Peter, James, and John see Moses and Elijah, well, they got to be looking at something. They're not looking at air. So there's still this sense that even though we have this other realm, this afterlife realm, where Moses and Elijah are, God makes them discernible in that scene. When people have visions, prophets have visions of, again, the spiritual realm. They're still looking at embodied people like angels or believers or whatever. Again, that is a concession, I think, both to the reader, and the writer, but I think also it's a concession that God makes for people to help people process the fact that when you die, even though you're disembodied, you're still you, and you will be able to recognize other people and believers. You'll be able to recognize the Lord. You'll be able to recognize Moses and Elijah. Again, we're not told exactly how that works, but all of these states of being, again, what I think people need to take away is they are all just as real collectively and individually. There's not one that's better than the other. That kind of thing. Like, I'm in the holding tank here and I got to wait for what's really good. You're not going to be thinking that in the presence of God.
Now, as we close, let's turn to the future hope we have as believers. As we've learned, the Bible is not concerned with giving you details about what happens immediately after we die. The hope we have as believers in Jesus is a future day when God will make all things right in Christ as He fully unites heaven and earth. Let's close with looking towards that day and the hope we all have because of Jesus. Death is not a pathway to heaven. Jesus is the pathway to destroying death so we can receive heaven on earth. Let me repeat that because it's important. Death is not a pathway to heaven. Death is an enemy to God and his people. Jesus is the pathway to destroying death so we can receive heaven on earth. The hope we have in the power of the resurrection eliminates death and brings us to the conclusion that God desires to have us as members of his family. Let's close with this beautiful hope together.
For most Western Christians, for the last few hundred years at least, the idea of death, bodily death, has been seen simply as the stepping stone into heaven or wherever it is we go after death, without any thought for what happens actually, according to the New Testament, in God's creation of new heavens and new earth. And so for many Christians, death has been seen as just a gateway into new life. And so it's not anything to worry about from that point of view, and we shouldn't be grieving over people who've died. So some people have taught. I remember going to funerals when I was a boy, and people who were being quite careful not to cry, not to weep, because whoever it was that had died had gone to a much better place. Well, the whole question of grief over death is something we may return to, but we have to remind ourselves that in the New Testament, death is the enemy. It is the last enemy, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, but it is not a kind, gentle friend ready to usher us into the presence of God. It is the negation of all that is good in creation. It is the moment of chaos, of dissolution, of God saying we cannot allow the corruption that has been introduced into the world through sin and folly. We cannot allow that to have free room to go on. God will not forever endorse the people that we have made ourselves into. Paul says in Romans 8, the body is dead because of sin. Then he does say the spirit is life because of righteousness, but how that works out is a whole other story to which we will return. The point is this: we have so easily imagined that it's just death and then heaven, and then we've forgotten that actually death is the destruction of the good creation, and that God's ultimate purpose is the reconstruction of heaven and earth and the resurrection to a new body which will be able to inhabit that new heavens and new earth. The original creation then has to be seen as good but transient. When God made the world, he made it very good, as Genesis says, but it was a project. It was going somewhere. And God put into his creation the symbols and signs of what it would take for humans to be his partners in that project. But if they were to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God says, on the day that you do that, you will die. Now, people have said, but they did it and they didn't die that day, but that's simply a misunderstanding of the Hebrew idiom. On the day that you do it, it doesn't mean within the 24-hour period immediately following your eating. Rather, it means once you do that, then you have signed up to death, and that's what's going to happen. And so Genesis 5, which tells the story of Adam and Eve's descendants, has ringing like a great bell through that chapter. So-and-so did this, he lived so-and-so, and then he died, and he died, and he died. It's a way of saying God meant what he said, that there is no way of sliding round the edge of that curse of death. And death is a curse. It's the denial of the goodness of creation. And there are some, from time to time, we see in the Old Testament who try to say that they have made a covenant with death. There's a passage in the book of Isaiah, chapter 28, where Isaiah denounces the people who say they have made a covenant with death. With Sheol we have an agreement. This is Isaiah 28, verse 15. And when the overwhelming scourge passes through, it won't come to us. We have made lies our refuge, and in falsehood we have taken shelter. In other words, humans try to fool themselves and try to fool one another that they can do a deal, that actually death isn't going to matter, that as some people have said death is nothing at all. There's a passage written by an old Anglican theologian from 100 years or more ago, which begins, "Death is nothing at all. I've just slipped into the next room." That is a lie. That's not what it's about. And actually, the theologian in question went on in the next paragraph of the sermon to explain that that may be how it seems from time to time when someone you love has just died, but actually it is a terrible, a horrible thing, a matter of the rending of one's very heart. So death is the destruction of what is good. It's not just an easy passage. And the Old Testament does, however, have glimpses of a rescue from death, not a going to heaven, but rather in Psalm 16, there is a promise that God will not abandon us. He will not let us see corruption, a promise which remains in abeyance until many years later it is fulfilled in Jesus. And then the book of Acts picks that up and quotes Psalm 16 in relation to Jesus, who was raised from the dead, and then going on to the promise that one day all Jesus' people will be raised from the dead, not just going to heaven, which interestingly the New Testament does not hold out as the ultimate goal at all, but rather the new world in which death will have been defeated. That's the point of it all. So the little hints that you get in Hosea chapter 6, in Ezekiel 37, and then a bit more explicitly in Daniel chapter 12, one of the passages which the later rabbis loved to quote when they were talking about resurrection. These are hints that God will do something more, not just, well, after death God will look after you, though he will, that's promised as well, but that eventually there will be a new creation and that death itself will be overcome. This is all based on the belief that God is the creator who has promised to put all things right. If you take away the idea of God as the good creator, then maybe this present world is a mess. It's just a fudge as thrown together by the forces of nature by themselves, and it may be a good thing if we escape it. Many people believe that today. Or if you think, well, yes, it was a good place, but it doesn't look as though anything good can now come out of it. In other words, God is not going to put it right. If you believe that, then again, no need for resurrection. Death may, it turns out, have the last word. But if God is the good creator, and if he is the judge who has promised to set everything right, then resurrection will follow. Death will be defeated. This, of course, bursts out in the New Testament in a whole new way. Jesus' announcement of God's kingdom coming on earth as in heaven, and Jesus pioneering the way of healing and hope throughout his short but powerful earthly career. These are ways of saying yes to life and no to death. So that even when Jesus weeps at the tomb of his friend, Lazarus, in John chapter 11, he weeps because death is cruel and nasty and mean. And Jesus can, even though Jesus knows that God the Father is going to overcome it in the case of Lazarus, and then specifically in his own case, Jesus weeps because he sees the damage that death does to communities, to families, and so on. But out of all that, Jesus is announcing that something new is on the way. When one of Lazarus' sisters said to him, if only you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died, Jesus says, your brother will rise again. And she says, well, I know he will rise at the resurrection on the last day. And Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Resurrection has come to life and is standing here talking to you. And so this is a way of saying death does not have the last word. And so resurrection is a way of talking about God's undoing of the destruction which death has brought about. And that, therefore, is also to do with forgiveness. Death comes because humans rebel against God. Resurrection and forgiveness go hand in hand. They are God's way of saying, I will make all things new. I will put everything right. And so in the New Testament, we can see that the idea of death is made into something which we can experience already in baptism. In Romans 6, Paul talks about dying with the Messiah and already rising with him, so that if you are a baptized and believing Christian, then there is a sense in which you have already passed from death to life. It's a fascinating promise which Jesus himself echoes in John 5, verse 24. If you are part of the Messiah's family, you will not come into judgment. You've already passed from death to life. So that after death, there is life, life with the Messiah in the temporary state, and then the fullness of resurrection life eventually. So there is, of course, a subsense in which, as all pastors know, when you are with somebody who is deeply sick and for whom the only way forward is through bodily death sometimes appears as a kindly friend, putting somebody, as we say rather crudely, out of their misery. Yes, that can be how it is. I have sat at the bedside of people who have died for whom it was, as it were, a blessed relief, a kind of a sigh of relief. But in the larger scale, that's not what was going on. Death is not a kindly friend. Death is the last enemy. And new heavens and new earth is God's defeat of death. We must not make the mistake of those in Isaiah 28 who thought they could make a covenant with death and say, it's all right, really. No, death is to be defeated. We must not make peace with it. It has been defeated by Jesus on the cross and in his resurrection. It will be defeated in the last day when God makes new heavens and new earth. And we are called in the present already to be people of life. Let's just be clear before we move on to Romans 8, what we are saying then about the future life beyond the grave. I have taken funerals, I have attended funerals of people I have loved and lost, and the question everyone wants to ask at funerals is, where are they now? Where is she now? Where is he now? That's a very natural question. That is the question that love wants to ask, and I honor that. It's perhaps surprising, therefore, that the New Testament has very little to say about that question, has a great deal to say about where we're ultimately headed, very little to say about the temporary thing. If you believe in resurrection, a new bodily life, you are bound to believe in some kind of intermediate waiting period, perhaps even an intermediate state. The Bible doesn't say very much about it. We are free to invent our own metaphors. John Polkinghorne says that God will download our software onto his hardware until the day when he gives us new hardware to run the software again. Well, okay. But get hold of it. Resurrection is not life after death. It is life after death. That is, it is the new bodily life that will follow a period of being bodily dead. That's how it was even for Jesus himself in between his death and resurrection. The only exception will be those still alive at the Lord's return, as Paul says. They will be changed. That's another radical Pauline innovation. Nobody had thought of that before, which deals with the problem of what would then happen, but which also makes it very clear that the present body and the future body are both continuous and different. Same for creation as a whole. God won't throw away the present one and start from scratch. He will, as he did with the body of Jesus himself, give new life to the present body. Oh, God can do new creation. If somebody has been burnt to ashes and their ashes have been scattered, whatever, and the entire physical system has gone, God is in the business of new creation. God is going to make a new you, which will be just like the present one, only much, much, much more so. There is a real, I've often used this in preaching. When you see somebody who's been really sick, and you haven't seen them for a while and they're really sick, and you see them, you say, poor old so-and-so, he's just a shadow of his former self. The truth of the resurrection, as for instance in 2 Corinthians 5, 1-10, is that if you are in Christ and indwelt by the Spirit, you are just a shadow of your future self. There is a real you which God is waiting to give you, and it's so like you that it's amazing, but it's more so, and all the great things which God is doing in you will be enhanced and fulfilled in that. But when it comes to intermediate state, Paul talks about being with the Messiah, which is far better. Philippians 1. Call it paradise if you like, as Jesus says to the dying brigand in Luke 23, or the temporary dwelling, the monai polai, which Jesus talks about in John 14. You can even call it heaven if you want, though the Bible doesn't do that. But the problem is this: the church's mission is shaped by its eschatology, whether it knows that or not. And if your eschatology is all about leaving this world and going somewhere else called heaven, your sense of what the church is there for will be completely different. But if your eschatology is biblical, not least Pauline, then you will realize that if we stand now between the resurrection of Jesus and the renewal of the whole creation, when the earth shall be filled with the knowledge and glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea, and when we'll be given new bodies to live in and celebrate that new world, then the mission of the church is something totally different. New creation has begun. And by the Spirit, we are incorporated into the risen Messiah so that we can be part of that new creation already in our life, in our unity, our holiness, our art, our music, our theology, our preaching and praying and practical kingdom work. So why are we so fixated on that temporary in-between stage? I've said it before, but it's such a good line, I'll say it again. Heaven is important, but it's not the end of the world.
That through these you may become sharers of the divine nature after escaping from the corruption that is in the world.
Being partakers of the divine nature means we will be like God. We will have a body like Jesus did after the resurrection. We will have eternal life, and with the loyal members of the heavenly host, we will be in God's family and worship Him forever. God will succeed in uniting His divine and human family for eternity. But the most amazing part of being in God's family is how Jesus, the unique Son of God, sees us. When Jesus became a man, He was made for a short time a little lower than the angels. Listen to the writer to the Hebrews.
But now, we do not yet see all things subjected to Him. But we see Jesus, for a short time made lower than the angels, so that apart from God, He might taste death on behalf of everyone.
Because God became man in Jesus, His mortal followers will become like Him and members of God's family. We are Jesus' siblings and the fruit of His ministry.
He is not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, I will proclaim your name to my brothers. In the midst of the assembly, I will sing in praise of you. And again, behold, I am the children God has given me.
Until that day, God wants us to tell the epic story of His war against supernatural rebellion, to help Him release those still held captive by unseen powers of darkness.
Stay tuned, subscribe, and press that bell so you can get the alerts and see all the important content that we have coming your way. We are just getting started here, and we have so much left to explore.